I was scraping the last of the garlic butter from the mixing bowl when I heard him say it. His voice carried from the dining room loud enough to be deliberate, quiet enough to deny it later. "She's basically just a servant who lives here rent-free," David said. "Cooking, cleaning, that's all she's good for anymore." My hand froze over the bowl. The silicone spatula sagged under its own weight. The garlic-smeared rim suddenly feeling too cold, too empty. The butter clung to the edges like it was holding on for dear life. Just like me. I didn't walk into the dining room. I didn't say his name. I didn't demand he explain himself in front of Sarah, who I knew would just press her manicured fingers to her lips and pretend it was a misunderstanding. She always did. Instead, I rinsed the spatula. Slowly, deliberately. Let the water run hot over my fingers until it stung enough to distract me from the thudding in my chest. It wasn't the first insult, but it was the most honest one. I dried my hands with the towel that hung by the stove blue with white embroidery. I'd sewn that detail myself. A little hibiscus in the corner. Sarah once said it was too ethnic for their neutral kitchen, but she'd kept it because it soaked up oil well. I folded it neatly and laid it on the counter. Then I turned, walked to my room, and shut the door behind me. My room. The guest room, technically. No closet, no bathroom. Just a bed, a lamp, and a side table I'd bought from a flea market 10 years ago and repainted myself. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. It held everything I hadn't given away yet: wedding albums, tax forms, my late husband's favorite cufflinks, the last sweater he wore before the chemo took his hair. And on top of it sat my purse. Inside the purse was a card. Thick cardstock. Gold lettering. Martin Henderson, Executive Director. Henderson and Associates. He'd given it to me at the company barbecue last month, after asking 3 times who made the lemon thyme chicken. When I told him I had, he laughed and said, "Well, if you're ever interested in a career change, we could use someone with your gift." I'd kept it because the paper felt expensive. Now I realized it felt like something else. An option. Stood and opened my closet, or rather, the makeshift rack on the far wall. I didn't have much to pack. I'd stopped buying new clothes the day I moved in. There didn't seem to be a point when most of my hours were spent in the kitchen or doing loads of laundry. For the kids. For David. For Sarah, even though she'd always refolded the towels like my method embarrassed her. I began folding my sweaters and slacks, stacking them in the canvas suitcase I'd brought with me from my old condo. It still had my initials stitched on the lining. W. Margaret Walsh. Not help. Not the cook. Not just a servant. David hadn't always been this way. I remember the boy who used to bring me dandelions wrapped in tissue paper after school. The boy who once cried when he broke a vase and thought I'd be mad. I'd hugged him and said, "You're worth more than anything that breaks." I suppose he forgot. Maybe I did. It was late by the time I finished packing. I didn't slam drawers or make a show of it. If they noticed the quiet, they didn't say anything. Sarah's voice carried upstairs, something about a yoga retreat. David was laughing. Laughing. The sound made my stomach churn. I reached for the purse again and took out the card. Underneath it was an envelope with an old bank statement. The same one from when I'd wired $200,000 my entire life insurance payout after Richard died into David's account. The memo line still said, "For your family's future." I had told myself I was securing their lives. That family meant pooling resources and leaning on each other. That had only worked one way. In the morning I rose early. I always did, out of habit. But this time I didn't start the coffee. I didn't lay out the kids' cereal bowls or warm David's lunch in the microwave. I didn't cut Sarah's lemon slices just so for her green tea. Instead, I zipped up my suitcase and changed into my navy sweater, the one Sarah said looked too formal for just being home. I brushed my bobbed hair, still streaked with grey but sleek. I applied the lightest touch of lip colour, tucked on my glasses, and took one last look around the room. It didn't feel like mine anymore. Maybe it never had. I left the door open behind me as I rolled the suitcase down the hallway. The wheels thudded against the tile like a warning. Sarah was already in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone while sipping coffee from the mug I'd bought her for Christmas. She didn't look up. "Morning," I said quietly. She blinked, then froze. "Oh, you're going somewhere?" I nodded. "I'll be moving out today." She straightened, suddenly alert. "Oh, wow. So soon? I mean, we didn't mean for you to rush or anything." "David just meant I understand," I said, my voice level. "Truly." She blinked again. "Okay, well, where will you stay? I have a few options." She didn't ask what they were. David came down the stairs in a t-shirt and pajama pants, rubbing his eyes. "Wait, what's going on?" "I'm leaving," I said simply. "Like you suggested." He blinked in confusion. "Wait, you don't have to. You already made it clear I'm not needed here, or wanted." "I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said." I didn't wait for his excuse. I walked past the entry table, picked up my coat, and opened the door. The morning was still cold, the sky overcast. I stood for a moment on the front porch, the one I had power washed last summer, where I'd watched my grandchildren play with sidewalk chalk not 3 months ago. None of that felt reachable now. I walked down the steps, past the flower bed I'd replanted in the spring, toward the sidewalk. My car waited across the street. I unlocked it, placed the suitcase in the back seat, and sat behind the wheel. I didn't look back. I started the engine and pulled away slowly. My hands trembled only once at the first stop sign, and then they steadied. It was done. I reached into the passenger seat and ran my thumb over the edge of Martin Henderson's card. Then I turned right, toward the part of town where I knew no one, and where no one knew me as just a servant. Didn't go far that morning. 10 blocks down, and 2 turns later, I pulled into a compact lot behind an old beige building, low roofline, faded sign that read Maplewood Apartments. It wasn't much, but I'd signed the lease 3 days prior under a name that still carried weight in a quiet corner of the city. Margaret Walsh, former school teacher, widow, baker of lemon-thyme chicken, owner of half a home that no longer felt like mine. The landlord, Miss Tan, met me outside the side entrance. She wore her usual cardigan, her keys jangling as she led me up the narrow staircase to Unit 2B. I'd paid cash in full 2 months ahead. No pets, no loud music, and "If the heater rattles, just give it a tap," she said, unlocking the door. "It's not fancy, but it's clean." "I don't need fancy," I told her. "Just peace." The apartment smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleanser. The furniture was mismatched: 2 armchairs in different shades of brown, a small table, with one leg shorter than the rest, and a kitchenette with laminate counters that had seen better decades. Still, the light filtered in through real curtains, and the floor was solid beneath my feet. I'd lived in worse. I'd survived far worse. I thanked Ms. Tan, who handed over the keys without asking too many questions. That was part of why I'd chosen this place. She was discreet, like a woman who'd made quiet exits herself. Once she left, I stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. Then I unzipped my suitcase, folded my navy sweater over the back of the nearest chair, and walked barefoot to the window. From there, I could see a strip of overgrown grass and the backside of a laundromat. A man in a baseball cap was loading. Dryers in the distance. I didn't cry. I didn't curse the quiet or wish for company. I made a cup of tea using a kettle I'd stashed in the suitcase, sat down at the table with the uneven leg, and pulled out the worn envelope with the old bank statement inside. That money was gone. Gone to drywall and mortgage payments and birthday balloons I was never thanked for. But I had something else now, an awareness that no one was coming to save me but me. I opened the small notepad I kept in my purse, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and began making a new list. Not of tasks, but of truths. I am not a burden. I am not invisible. I am not a servant. I am still becoming. After a while, I took out my phone and stared at the contact I had saved under barbecue guy. Martin Henderson. The last time I'd seen him, he was holding a paper plate and asking for a second helping. His wife had leaned over and said, "You need to open a restaurant." I'd laughed it off. I tapped the call button and let it ring. Hello? His voice was deeper than I remembered, but still friendly. "Mr. Henderson," I said. "This is Margaret Walsh." A pause. Then, "The lemon chicken magician?" I smiled, despite myself. "That's the one. What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" "I'm calling about your offer. You once said you needed help with client entertaining." I remember. His tone shifted, slightly more focused now. "Are you interested?" I looked around at the apartment, at the mismatched furniture and empty fridge. "I'm available. And I have recipes that could charm a CFO into signing a merger blindfolded." He chuckled. "I like that. You free for coffee tomorrow morning? I'd like to talk more." "I'll bring the pastries," I said. After I hung up, I felt something new settle in my chest. Not relief. Not quite hope. Something sturdier. Like reclaiming my own time. That evening, I walked 2 blocks to a market that smelled of spices and sawdust. I bought flour, butter, and lemons. Back in the apartment, I borrowed a baking sheet from Ms. Tan and made shortbread cookies. Simple, crisp, not too sweet. The kind of thing you could trust. I packed them neatly in wax paper and went to bed without watching the news, without checking if Sarah had texted, without wondering if David had noticed I'd gone. I slept, really slept, not the kind of shallow dozing I'd grown used to, listening for creaking stairs or the microwave door slamming. No one needed me to be alert. No one needed me at all. It was both terrifying and beautiful. The next morning, I dressed with care. Same navy sweater, pressed slacks, a pale cream blouse beneath it. I pulled my hair back slightly with 2 silver pins and applied just a touch of lip tint. Not because anyone expected me to, but because I liked how it made my face look deliberate. I met Mr. Henderson at a corner cafe with peeling paint and chipped mugs. He wore a grey blazer over jeans and greeted me with both hands extended. "Margaret Walsh," he said. "You came." I said I would. He gestured to the seat across from him and eyed the tin I placed gently on the table. "What's in there?" "A soft bribe." He laughed. "You'll fit right in." We talked for over an hour. He asked questions not about my age or my health, but about how I planned menus, how I balanced salt and heat, whether I preferred savory or sweet for corporate receptions. I told him the truth. I cared more about texture than flavor. People remembered what crumbled, not what shocked. By the end of the meeting, he asked if I'd like to do a trial run for an upcoming executive luncheon. Nothing grand, just 40 people. I accepted without hesitation. As we stood to leave, he said, "You know, your son's a sharp employee, but he never mentioned you were this good." I held his gaze. "My son doesn't really know me." His smile faltered just for a second, and I could tell he understood more than he said. I walked back to the apartment in crisp morning light, the tin lighter in my hands, but my steps heavier with purpose. The day stretched open before me, not filled with someone else's errands or another list written in someone else's hand. But mine. I was starting over. Not to prove anything, not to take revenge, but because I could and for the first time in years, I felt like that was enough. The first week passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind I hadn't known since before Richard died. No alarms, no tense silence. Over breakfast. No stepping around someone else's comfort to maintain a peace that never really included me. I cooked only when I wanted to. I went to bed with a novel. Not exhaustion. And when the silence filled the apartment, it sounded like freedom. But freedom, I was learning, came with paperwork. On Wednesday, I opened the envelope I had tucked into the bottom of my suitcase. A red one, thick with old records and photocopies. I hadn't looked at it in years, but now it felt like armor. Inside were documents David had forgotten, or perhaps never read. Copies of the deed, co-ownership records, and the insurance transaction receipts. I laid them out across the table, weighed them down with 2 ceramic mugs, and sorted through. Every page. There it was. A copy of the house deed, our names side by side. Margaret Walsh and David Walsh. I had asked for it to be that way after Richard died, not out of suspicion, but out of some practical instinct. Richard had always been the planner. When he passed, I became the one who asked the questions no one wanted to hear. David, at the time, had agreed without hesitation. Of course, Mom. You're helping with the down payment. It's only fair. Now, I saw how easily fairness becomes inconvenient when memory starts to fade, or when someone assumes you're too worn down to fight back. Reached for my notebook and wrote another list. Not truths this time. Steps. Contact James Walsh, attorney request. Updated property file, review current mortgage activity, check tax filings. Dependency status, protect what's mine. That last line, I underlined twice. I hadn't spoken to James. In nearly 4 years, not since Richard's will was finalized. He was no relation, despite the shared surname, just a decent man with sharp eyes, who always returned calls. His secretary picked up after 2 rings. Walsh Law Offices, this is Trina. This is Margaret Walsh, I said. I was a client a few years ago. I need to speak with Mr. Walsh about property matters. There was a pause then. He's in today. Let me see if he's available. While I waited, I reached for the last shortbread cookie I'd made the night before. The tin was nearly empty now. I hadn't meant to eat them all, but they'd comforted me in ways conversation couldn't. Powdered sugar left a faint trail on the table, like footprints in snow. Miss Walsh? James's voice was unchanged, clear, calm, unhurried. I believe. I have a situation, I said. And I believe my son may have taken advantage of our shared property. He didn't interrupt. He let me speak. I told him about the overheard conversation, the comments, my sudden move. I told him about the card from Mr. Henderson, and how it had reminded me I was still a person, not just a position someone filled for free. When I mentioned the deed, James asked, "Do you have a copy?" "I do." "Bring it. Let's go over everything." We met the next morning in his office on Beechwood Avenue, where nothing had changed, except the plant by the window. It used to be a snake plant. Now it was a dusty ficus. James flipped through the papers I handed him, nodding slowly. He held the deed to the light, then the insurance documents. Then he tapped one page with the blunt end of his pen. "Here's the problem," he said. "There's a second mortgage recorded this year, but your signature isn't on it." My stomach went cold. "Are you certain?" "Positive. If your name's on the deed, any major loan must have your written consent." He looked up. "Did you sign anything in the last 6 months?" "No. Not even a thank you note." "Then it's likely forged. And if he used your half of the equity, that's fraud." We can request documentation from the lender and subpoena the original application if necessary. I sat back in the chair, not surprised but tired. Bone-deep tired. He told someone I was just a servant, I said. James's face didn't change, but something tightened at the corners of his mouth. You're not the first parent to be discarded after giving everything, he said. But you might be one of the few who walked away before they packed your things. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He handed back the documents and said he'd begin the inquiry. And Margaret, he added, if anything else comes up, tax filings, credit fraud, threats, you call me first. I thanked him and walked out into the bright midday air, shielding my eyes as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The wind caught a loose strand of my hair and whipped it across my cheek. I tucked it behind my ear, then stood still for a moment, breathing. A gust blew powdered sugar from the sleeve of my sweater. That afternoon, I returned to the apartment and found a voicemail waiting on my phone. David. Mom. Hey. We, noticed your room's still got some things in the closet. Not a lot, but if you want us to ship them, we can. Just send an address. No rush. His voice cracked a little at the end, like he thought a crumb of courtesy would undo what had been said. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat at my table and began drafting a letter to the mortgage lender, requesting a notarized copy of the signed documents on file. If David had really forged my name, I needed the proof in hand. There would be no shouting. Matches, no Facebook posts, no begging him to remember the woman who braided his hair after night terrors or stayed awake sewing Halloween costumes long after midnight. Those parts of me were still real, but they didn't entitle him to anything now. That night, I stood at the kitchen counter and rolled dough between my palms for a new batch of cookies, orange zest and cinnamon, my mother's recipe. She used to say baking was about control, heat, time, ratio, precision that gave birth to comfort. She was right. This time, I didn't make them for anyone else. I made them for me. 3 days later, I stood in line at the bank with an envelope pressed flat between my palms. Inside were photocopies of the loan. Documents James had requested from the lender arrived just that morning by courier. Folded twice, but still crisp. I hadn't needed to read more than a page to know it was forged. The signature beside my name was too perfect, too rounded. Like someone had practiced it slowly, without the urgency or motion of real consent. It looked like mine in the way mannequins resemble people. The teller called me forward. I deposited a check, one of the last, from an account David no longer had access to. My fingers trembled a little as I slid it across the counter, not from fear, but from the reality that I was reclaiming more than just cash. I was untangling my identity from the financial scaffolding he'd built around my silence. The young woman behind the glass smiled politely and handed me the receipt. Is there anything else I can help you with today, Miss Walsh? No, I said, folding the receipt in half and slipping it into my purse. Not today. On the way out, I passed the bulletin board near the lobby, local events, community fundraisers, and a flyer pinned slightly askew. Looking for local caterers for chamber mixer. Contact Kelsey at City Hall. I paused. I wasn't a caterer. Not officially, not on paper. But I could dice onions faster than most line cooks. And I knew how to stretch a casserole into a conversation. The flyer wasn't addressed to me, but it felt like permission anyway. I tore off a tab with the number and tucked it between the folds of my palm like a secret. Back at the apartment, I placed the envelope of forged documents in the same drawer as the notarized deed copy and the bank statements James had highlighted. The folder was growing, heavy with evidence not just of wrongdoing, but of erasure. If they had succeeded, I would have been buried in bureaucracy, my name struck from paper even while I was still very much alive. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the balcony. The autumn air had a dampness to it. Not quite rain, but something that lingered on the skin. A child in the neighboring building was crying, not wailing, just that soft, worn-out weeping that comes at the end of a long day. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. I thought of David at age 6, curled up in a laundry basket pretending to be a cat. Meow, he'd say between giggles. You can't tell I'm not a real one, right? At the time, I'd played along, crouching next to the basket with a bowl of Cheerios and calling him Whiskers. And now? Now he was a grown man with forged signatures in his drawer and a mother he treated like a liability. The child I'd raised was still in there somewhere. I believed that, but I couldn't go digging for him anymore. Some truths had to be left in their baskets. My phone buzzed beside the teacup. Unknown number. I picked it up. Ms. Walsh? The voice asked. This is Kelsey from City Hall. I got your message about the catering request. I straightened. Yes, I saw the flyer. We're looking for someone local who can prepare finger food for around 50 people. Mostly business owners and city staff. It's not a paid gig, but you're free to distribute cards, samples, anything promotional. Great exposure. I paused. Not paid, but seen. That's fine, I said. When is it? Next Friday. Evening. We can provide tables and electricity. You'd just bring the food and any signage. I'll be there. I hung up, set the phone down, and leaned back in my chair. It wasn't a paycheck, but it was a door. One that David hadn't opened, and Sarah hadn't approved, and no one could close behind me. That night, I began planning a menu. I didn't start with what was cheapest or what would photograph best. I started with stories. I wrote down the cinnamon walnut tarts my grandmother made for every holiday, and the red pepper goat cheese crostanese Richard used to request on his birthday. I added the lemon thyme chicken that had made Martin Henderson pause mid-bite and scribble his card across a napkin. Food wasn't just flavor, it was memory, and mine was sharper than ever. The next morning, I walked to the local print shop and designed a set of flyers. Not flashy. Just a name, Margaret Walsh Home Kitchen, and a line of text. Small batch. Handcrafted. Unforgettable. Below that, my number. No website. No social handles. I wanted people to call me. To hear my voice. To know I was real. The young man behind the counter offered to laminate one for free. Looks classy, he said. Thank you, I replied. I've been invisible long enough. I spent the rest of the day baking test batches and wrapping samples in parchment. I didn't overthink plating or garnish. I trusted my hands. Trusted the years in my wrists and the wisdom in my fingertips. I didn't need reinvention. I just needed return. Late that night, after the final tray cooled and the kitchen was wiped clean, I sat at the table and opened a letter I hadn't touched in years. Richard had written me on our 35th anniversary. It wasn't long, just 3 lines. You make the ordinary sacred, Margaret. I'm always proud. Never forget your name. I folded it closed, eyes dry, breath steady. I wasn't forgetting anything anymore. The folding table rocked slightly beneath the weight of the crostini trays, but I steadied it with a paper napkin under. The shortest leg. The City Hall atrium buzzed around me, murmurs of introductions, the soft clink of wine glasses, and the rustle of jackets shrugged off under 2 warm lights. I took a breath and stepped back, arms crossed loosely, taking in my own corner. My booth wasn't the largest. No banners or LED screens, no branded giveaways or sleek QR codes. Just a black linen tablecloth, handwritten signs, and food that still carried warmth from my kitchen. 3 women hovered near the tartlets, nodding to each other in approval. One of them picked up a flyer and tucked it carefully into her clutch. From across the room, I could see Mr. Henderson talking to a group near the podium. He caught my eye briefly and offered a small nod, more respect than I'd ever been offered in my own home. My name tag read, Margaret Walsh, Home Kitchen, and for once, it felt accurate. There was no mom scribbled beneath it, no whisper of helpful live-in grandmother, or my husband's mom. Just me. By the time the third wave of attendees circled back, I'd nearly run out of the goat cheese croissants. I'd watched people take seconds. Some had returned with colleagues in tow. A man in a charcoal blazer leaned forward, wiping crumbs off his cuff as he smiled. Who catered this table? I raised my hand slightly. That would be me. He nodded, chewing slowly. You in business? Not officially, I said. But I'm available. He handed me a card. Real estate development. We have quarterly events. Always looking for reliable local flavor. Your rosemary shortbread's the only thing my CFOs come back for twice. I accepted the card with both hands. Thank you. I'll follow up, no fanfare. No applause. But it felt like the world had shifted 2 degrees in my favor. And then I saw them. Sarah first, followed by David. She was wearing that ivory blouse she reserved for occasions she wanted to look approachable. He looked uncomfortable in a navy button-down, probably borrowed from one of his more polished co-workers. They didn't approach right away. Sarah pointed out booths while David nodded absently, hands shoved into his pockets. I could tell by the way his eyes kept flicking around that he hadn't expected me to be here. Good. I didn't move. I stayed, planted behind my table, offering toothpicks and samples and warm thank yous to strangers. Eventually, their wandering brought them to me, and David froze like someone spotting a ghost that had outlived its funeral. Mom? He said, unsure whether he was surprised or caught. David. Sarah. Sarah was faster with her recovery. We didn't know you were catering this, she said, scanning the table. This is really something. It's a city event, I said, smiling faintly. Anyone could apply. David shifted his weight. You've been busy. I have, I said. Turns out I'm good at more than just cooking. I'm good at running a kitchen. He cleared his throat. We've been meaning to call. Sarah suggested we send over some of the things you left behind. I left behind more than sweaters, I replied. But the things that mattered are already with me. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Sarah glanced at the crostini, reached for one, then paused. Please, I said, motioning gently. They're not poisoned. She picked one up, took a small bite and nodded. Delicious, she murmured. I watched David study the table. He didn't take anything. He just looked at the rows of neatly arranged pastries and canapes, then at the flyers, then finally at the name tag pinned to my chest. I didn't know you had business cards, he said quietly. I didn't know you had 2 mortgages. His face changed, not dramatic, but enough. A small flicker of panic in the eyes. I know, I added, because I requested the documents. And I saw the signature. He didn't deny it. He looked at Sarah, who stared down at the floor tiles. I'm not here to embarrass you, I said. I'm here because I earned this space, not with permission, and not through you. He nodded once, curt and clipped. We'll be in touch. I'm sure you will, I said. They left without a goodbye. But I didn't let them take the moment with them. I stood a little taller behind the table, passed a croissant sandwich to a woman with a bright blue scarf, and asked if she needed a quote for a December brunch. By the end of the night, I had 5 new contacts and a request for a wedding tasting. More than that, I had something I hadn't felt in years. Presence. Real, recognized, Earned presents. As I packed up the trays and stacked my signs, Mr. Henderson approached, hands tucked into his coat. I knew you'd be good, he said. But I didn't expect lines. I didn't either. I replied, but I prepared for them. He smiled. We've got an executive retreat next month. Would you consider running the menu? I'd be honored. He hesitated a moment, then added, David didn't exactly shine tonight. He rarely does when someone else is holding the light. Mr. Henderson gave a low whistle. You're sharper than you let on. I've just stopped dulling myself for the sake of comfort. We shook hands, no cameras, no contract yet. But everything was shifting. Back in the apartment that night, I unloaded the trays and placed a few leftover pastries on a plate. I made tea, added a touch of honey, and sat down at the kitchen table. The folder of legal documents sat nearby, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I picked up one of the flyers I hadn't passed out. Margaret Walsh Home Kitchen. Small batch. Handcrafted. Unforgettable. The oven was still warm. So was I. Write the next part of an emotionally grounded, non-repetitive, well-structured narrative centered on an elderly woman narrator. The story should be rich in meaningful events and follow a sensible, engaging plotline without repeating lines or ideas. It should not contain emojis and must be in a storytelling narration format. Maintain consistent emotional progression and narrative clarity. This part must contain 1,100 words. At the end of this 1,100-word section, include a highly detailed visual prompt for Leonardo or ideogram image generation. This prompt must clearly describe the narrator a consistent old woman character by specifying her hair color, clothing color, and skin tone. The prompt must also describe her current situation, surrounding setting, and any emotional or symbolic context from the scene. The visual prompt must reflect exactly what is happening in the story at that specific point and must always feature the narrator in the frame. Chosen character: modern wise woman, sleek bob haircut with streaks of grey stylish glasses, navy sweater, confident expression, minimal makeup. 2 days after the City Hall event, a manila envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Sarah's tight cursive, with exaggerated loops in the D's and Y's. For a moment, I thought of the Christmas labels she used to decorate in metallic ink, always spelling my name wrong. To Margaret, with glitter that never stuck. I opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the packet inside. Preliminary transfer. Agreement, residential property. My name was typed at the top. The document included sections detailing the reassignment of full home ownership to David and Sarah Walsh. It was dressed up in legal niceties, phrases like streamlining of property responsibility, and as previously agreed among parties. But it was a lie from the first line. I flipped to the signature page. My line was blank. But beside it, David's name was already signed, along with a third signature I didn't recognize. A notary. Likely forged. Likely paid. Attached was a post-it note in Sarah's neat handwriting. No rush. We just need this signed before Friday to move forward with bank approvals. Thanks again, Mom. Thanks again. As if she were asking me to sign for a UPS package, not relinquish the last shred of financial power I held in their lives. I stared at the page, my fingers pressing into the corners until they bent. I didn't scream. I didn't pace. I stood, walked to the sink, and placed the envelope in the freezer. Not out of strategy, but instinct. I needed it out of sight. I needed 5 minutes to breathe. I returned to the table and opened my recipe journal, flipping past pages of source ratios and party menus until I landed on a blank one. I picked up my pen and began to write not ingredients, but observations. Sarah had not called. David had not asked. This was another performance. A paper trail to frame me as a willing participant. I knew the tactic. I'd seen it used on clients back when Richard and I handled estate matters together. You make the other party feel it's already done. You speak in past tense until it becomes truth. I poured myself a glass of water and took slow, measured sips. Then I called James. His voice on the other end was clipped, businesslike. Talk to me, Margaret. I described the packet. The notary. The tone of the note. His questions came quick and precise. Did I speak to anyone about this prior? Had I responded in writing to any similar suggestion? Had I verbally agreed to anything? No, I said. I haven't even replied to their texts. Good, he said. That means their case is nothing but dust. But I want you to scan every page and send it to me. Do not discard it. Do not. Mark it up. And don't speak with them about it. This isn't just unethical. If the signature was pre-filled, it's bordering on fraud. We ended the call and I did exactly what he said. I photographed each page carefully, my fingers keeping the edges flat, and emailed them to James with the subject line: unauthorized property transfer attempt. Afterward, I sat on the couch and stared at the envelope, still wedged between a bag of frozen peas and a tray of puff pastry. It looked ridiculous in there, but there was something fitting about it to how their intentions had gone cold, preserved only for evidence. I left it there and turned back to the stove. My hands needed to move, and my mind needed the anchor of repetition. I sifted flour, diced garlic, marinated chicken. By sunset, the apartment smelled like a meal meant for 10. Though no one was coming, the silence felt more like choice now. That evening, I walked down to the small courtyard behind the building. It was half paved, half dirt, with a lone garden bed that most tenants ignored. Last month, I'd asked Ms. Tan if I could tend to it. She'd said sure, as long as I didn't plant anything weird. I knelt in the dirt and loosened the soil, sprinkling crushed eggshells along the roots of a young rosemary bush I'd planted weeks ago. I pressed my fingers into the earth, grounding myself in something real, something unspoken and growing. I stayed there until the street lamps buzzed to life, casting long shadows over the empty lot. My knees ached, but I welcomed it. A pain that reminded me I was still moving forward, inch by inch. When I returned to the apartment, I opened the freezer, pulled out the envelope, and slipped it into a Ziploc bag labeled with the date. Let them build a narrative. I was writing my own. The knock came just after 8. Not frantic, not friendly. 3 firm raps, intentional, measured, the kind that expected to be heard and answered. I had just set down a tray of rosemary muffins to cool, the kitchen still thick with steam and butter, when I froze at the sound. Most people text these days. Even neighbors. A knock like that meant someone didn't want there to be a record. Wiped my hands on a tea towel and opened the door partway. David stood in the hallway. His eyes were tired, the skin beneath them shadowed. He wore the same navy button-down I'd seen at the mixer, but now it was rumpled and missing a button at the cuff. His mouth moved before any sound came out. I didn't expect you to answer. Yet here you are, I said. He exhaled, glancing past me as if searching for a different version of me inside. Someone softer. Someone who hadn't read the documents. Or maybe someone who'd just been too afraid to respond. I didn't move to open the door further. I came to talk. He said, about the forgery? Or the envelope you had Sarah mail without a return address? His jaw tightened. I didn't forge anything. Then someone did, I said. And your name is on every line. He looked down at his shoes, then up again, quieter now. I was desperate. I let the word hang in the air. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he added. I thought I don't know. That you'd cool off. That you'd get over it. Get over what? I asked. The realization that my place in your home was conditional on my silence? That my care, my labor, my savings, all of it meant less to you than a monthly payment? His face contorted. Not quite shame. Not quite sorrow. Something more selfish. The panic of someone watching the floor buckle beneath their feet. We've had a hard year, he said finally. Sarah's mother needed surgery, and the kids' tuition. And so you stole from me? His eyes flashed. It wasn't like that. You took out a mortgage using my name, without my consent. You filled out a signature line and tried to convince a notary I'd signed it. That is exactly what it's like. He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. David, I said, I baked every cake at your birthday for 30 years. I clipped your nails when you broke your arm. I drove to your high school at midnight because you'd left your science project in the gym. I gave you everything I had left after your father died. What I didn't give you, what I never will, is permission to erase me. His shoulders dropped. I didn't come here to beg, he said finally. I came here to ask if there's any way to fix it. Without court, without lawyers. Why now? He hesitated. Mr. Henderson found out. I nodded. That made sense. Henderson was a man who measured trust as carefully as quarterly profits. And I'd said just enough to him to raise the right questions. Are you here because you want to repair our relationship? Or because your reputation's cracking? I asked. He didn't answer. I stepped back, opened the door fully, and pointed to the tray of muffins on the counter. Take a few. You look hungry. He blinked. But know this, I added. You're not stepping into my home to plead your case. You're stepping into it as someone I no longer trust. He nodded and walked inside. Slowly, like the floor might bite him. He picked up a muffin, warm and fragrant, and held it without eating. This used to be what coming home smelled like, he said. It still is, I replied. For me. He looked around the space. Small, clean, with the signs of independence. In every corner, my handwritten schedule on the fridge, my flyers stacked near the fruit bowl, the thick folder of documents resting beside the coffee pot. I didn't hide any of it. He could see exactly what I was working with. I wanted him to. I've made mistakes, he said. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. That's the thing about erosion, I replied. It never announces itself. It just wears away at the foundation until it's too late. We sat at the small table. He took a bite of the muffin. I waited. I can't undo what I've done, he said. But if you're willing to sell your share legally, I can pay you back over time. Full price. Interest included. You forged your way into this mess, I said. You don't get to negotiate the terms of my forgiveness. His hands tightened around the muffin paper. I'm not trying to win, he said softly. I'm trying to stop losing. It was the first thing he'd said that sounded real. Still, I stood. I'll consider your offer. In writing. Through my attorney. He stood too, slower now. I understand. At the door, he paused. I didn't know you had it in you. I didn't either, I said, until I had to. After he left, I sat back down at the table and picked up the folder. I added a new note in the margin of my legal outline. He came. He didn't lie, but he still wanted control. Then I added one more line under it. Grace doesn't require amnesia. Outside. The air had cooled again. I opened the window and let it in, the scent of rosemary wafting up from the planter below. The knock came just after 8. Not frantic, not friendly. 3 firm raps, intentional, measured, the kind that expected to be heard and answered. I had just set down a tray of rosemary muffins to cool, the kitchen still thick with steam and butter, when I froze at the sound. Most people text these days. Even neighbors. A knock like that meant someone didn't want there to be a record. Wiped my hands on a tea towel and opened the door partway. David stood in the hallway. His eyes were tired, the skin beneath them shadowed. He wore the same navy button-down I'd seen at the mixer, but now it was rumpled and missing a button at the cuff. His mouth moved before any sound came out. "I didn't expect you to answer. Yet here you are," I said. He exhaled, glancing past me as if searching for a different version of me inside. Someone softer. Someone who hadn't read the documents. Or maybe someone who'd just been too afraid to respond. I didn't move to open the door further. "I came to talk," he said. "About the forgery? Or the envelope you had Sarah mail without a return address?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't forge anything." "Then someone did," I said. "And your name is on every line." He looked down at his shoes, then up again, quieter now. "I was desperate." I let the word hang in the air. "I didn't think you'd actually leave," he added. "I thought, I don't know, that you'd cool off. That you'd get over it." "Get over what?" I asked. The realization that my place in your home was conditional on my silence. That my care, my labor, my savings, all of it meant less to you than a monthly payment. His face contorted. Not quite shame. Not quite sorrow. Something more selfish. The panic of someone watching the floor buckle beneath their feet. "We've had a hard year," he said finally. "Sarah's mother needed surgery, and the kids' tuition. And so you stole from me?" His eyes flashed. "It wasn't like that. You took out a mortgage using my name, without my consent. You filled out a signature line and tried to convince a notary I'd signed it. That is exactly what it's like." He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. "David," I said, "I baked every cake at your birthday for 30 years. I clipped your nails when you broke your arm. I drove to your high school at midnight because you'd left your science project in the gym. I gave you everything I had left after your father died. What I didn't give you, what I never will, is permission to erase me." His shoulders dropped. "I didn't come here to beg," he said finally. "I came here to ask if there's any way to fix it. Without court, without lawyers. Why now?" He hesitated. "Mr. Henderson found out." I nodded. That made sense. Henderson was a man who measured trust as carefully as quarterly profits. And I'd said just enough to him to raise the right questions. "Are you here because you want to repair our relationship? Or because your reputation's cracking?" I asked. He didn't answer. I stepped back, opened the door fully, and pointed to the tray of muffins on the counter. "Take a few. You look hungry." He blinked. "But know this," I added. "You're not stepping into my home to plead your case. You're stepping into it as someone I no longer trust." He nodded and walked inside. Slowly. Like the floor might bite him. He picked up a muffin, warm and fragrant, and held it without eating. "This used to be what coming home smelled like," he said. "It still is," I replied. "For me." He looked around the space. Small, clean, with the signs of independence in every corner. My handwritten schedule on the fridge. My flyers stacked near the fruit bowl. The thick folder of documents resting beside the coffee pot. I didn't hide any of it. He could see exactly what I was working with. I wanted him to. "I've made mistakes," he said. "But I didn't mean for it to go this far. That's the thing about erosion," I replied. "It never announces itself. It just wears away at the foundation. Until it's too late." We sat at the small table. He took a bite of the muffin. I waited. "I can't undo what I've done," he said. But if you're willing to sell your share legally, I can pay you back over time. Full price, interest included. You forged your way into this mess, I said. You don't get to negotiate the terms of my forgiveness. His hands tightened around the muffin paper. I'm not trying to win, he said softly. I'm trying to stop losing. It was the first thing he'd said that sounded real. Still, I stood. I'll consider your offer. In writing. Through my attorney. He stood too, slower now. I understand. At the door, he paused. I didn't know you had it in you. I didn't either, I said. Until I had to. After he left, I sat back down at the table and picked up the folder. I added a new note in the margin of my legal outline. He came. He didn't lie. But he still wanted control. Then I added, one more line under it. Grace doesn't require amnesia. Outside. The air had cooled again. I opened the window and let it in, the scent of rosemary wafting up from the planter below. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. No alarm. Just the kind of stillness that comes when your body understands there's work ahead. Not the kind that drains you, but the kind that asks you to rise clear-eyed and sober. I sat at the kitchen table with a ledger in front of me. Not the legal kind, not even digital. Just an old-school spiral-bound notebook I used to track household expenses when David was a child. I'd unearthed it from a plastic bin in the back of my closet weeks earlier, not knowing then how much I'd need its clarity now. Each line was crisp, even after years in storage. Groceries, field trip fees, rent envelopes with pink stamps. Every check I wrote to cover the gap between what David needed and what life gave him. But today, I wasn't here to tally the past. I was here to make a new list. What I gave. What they took. Not just in dollars, but in hours. In favors. In holidays missed because I stayed to babysit. In weekends spent cooking while they smiled in matching sweaters on someone else's Instagram feed. I wrote each one down. Covered the deposit on the house. $200,000. 4 years of unpaid childcare. Incalculable personal grocery budget doubled to accommodate them cleaning, repairs, cooking 365 days x 5 years emotional labor. Every silent forgiveness. Every polite nod. The more I wrote, the steadier my hand became. Not bitter, not vengeful, just truthful. I wasn't weaponizing the past. I was reclaiming its value. At 9 sharp, I sent James the scanned copy of David's revised offer. It had arrived in my inbox just after midnight. A formal proposal to buy out my share of the house at market value, paid in structured monthly installments. James called 15 minutes later. He's making this move because he's afraid, he said. Not because it's generous. I know, I replied. But I'm not here to punish him. I just want to walk away clean. James sighed. We'll draft a counter. One that protects you fully. And Margaret. Yes? Whatever you do, don't sign anything until I send it through. No matter what promises they make. I agreed. I wasn't the woman who signed things blindly anymore. Around noon, I got a call from Mr. Henderson's secretary. The company's winter gala was scheduled in 2 weeks, and they wanted me to oversee the full menu. I know it's short notice, she said, but the CEO himself requested you. Said your lemon tart was the only dessert that's ever made him feel feelings. I smiled and accepted. After the call, I walked down to the post office. I needed more flyers printed for the event, and the clerk at the desk, an older woman, with steel grey braids, gave me a knowing look as she handed over the proofs. You look like a woman with a plan, she said. I've got more than one, I replied. I stopped at the cafe next door for a quick tea and found a quiet table. By the window, As I waited, I noticed a family sitting 2 tables away, a grandmother, her son, and 2 little girls with matching ponytails. The older girl spilled her cocoa and the grandmother wiped it up without a word, smiling faintly as she dabbed the table dry with a napkin. I watched the father. He didn't thank her, didn't even look her way, just continued scrolling through. His phone. The grandmother caught my gaze and gave a small shrug. A flicker of recognition passed between us, an understanding too common among women of a certain age, who know what it is to be useful but unseen. I nodded. Back at home, I cleaned my kitchen like I was preparing for company, not out of performance, but out of respect. For myself, for the space, for the life that was mine alone. I placed a framed picture of Richard on the shelf above the stove one, where he's grinning in a windbreaker, holding a fish he never expected to catch. His eyes had that crinkled joy I used to call his sunset smile. It had been tucked away in a drawer, too intimate for the old house where everything felt surveilled. But here, he could be seen again. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat down and wrote him a letter. Dear Richard, you'd have hated how this went down. The silence, the disrespect, the pretending. You always believed in confronting things head on, in calling a thing what it was. I wish I'd followed your lead sooner. David isn't the boy you taught to drive or the man we hoped he'd become. But he's still our son. And while I can't excuse him, I can release the part of me that thought I could fix what he won't even name. I'm okay now. Really, the house was never the point. The power wasn't in the deed, it was in my choice to walk away, to rebuild, to write menus instead of apology notes, to feed people who see me, to look in the mirror and not apologize for staying too long, or for leaving late. You'd love the rosemary muffins. I'll make you some when we meet again. Yours always. I folded the letter and placed it in the recipe book, tucked between the pages with the handwritten crust ratios. Then I washed my hands, tied on my apron, and got back to work. The wind had turned sharp by the time I walked to the lawyer's office the next morning. The sky overhead was a clean, wintry blue, the kind that reminded me of the Midwest winters Richard and I used to complain about but secretly missed. I wore a heavier coat over my navy sweater and kept one gloved hand wrapped around the envelope I was bringing to James. Inside it was a counteroffer our version. James had called it protective but fair. No staggered monthly payments. No half-hearted installments. David would have 30 days to secure financing for a full buyout of my co-ownership stake, assessed at today's market value. If he failed to meet the deadline, the house would be listed for sale, and I would retain the right to approve or reject any offer. Legal. Simple. Final. James had written it in language that didn't beg for understanding. It demanded clarity. At the front desk, Trina offered me a cup of tea while James finished a call. I declined but thanked her with a small smile. I was beginning to notice how easily people made room for me now, not because I demanded it, but because I'd stopped shrinking. James brought me into the office, motioned for me to sit, and closed the door behind us. You good with this? He asked, tapping the folder gently. I am. He nodded. Then we send it today. No other communication until he responds in writing. He paused before adding, he won't like the terms. I didn't like being erased. He met my eyes, and I saw something shift, something like respect, but deeper. He didn't offer comfort. He offered acknowledgement. It was more valuable. By the time I stepped back outside, the chill had grown teeth. I pulled my coat tighter and walked slowly back toward the apartment, my boots crunching over the edge of an early frost. At a corner bench, I paused to watch a group of children chase one another through a patch of brittle grass. Their laughter bounced in the air, raw, untamed, loud in the way only children can be without apology. For a moment, I saw David at that age. 7, maybe 8, running like he was made of helium. Hair wild, shirt half tucked, cheeks flushed. Back then, I believed love alone would be enough to keep him safe. That if I just gave and gave and gave, he'd never grow cold. But love that isn't honored becomes a ledger with no balance. I reached into my bag, pulled out a pen, and jotted a new line in my small notebook. You cannot be respected by those who believe your love is endless. That afternoon I returned to baking. Not for comfort, for purpose. The winter gala menu needed finalizing. I mixed, measured, and adjusted for scale, converting my rosemary shortbread recipe to serve 150, tweaking my citrus glaze so it would hold under warm lighting without melting. Into Gloucester it was work, but it was mine. While the tart crusts cooled, I returned to my emails and saw a reply from Kelsey at City Hall. They were requesting a quote for an upcoming women's business luncheon. She added a note. Your name came up 3 times in last week's meeting. Apparently, your crustanees started more networking than our keynote speaker. I laughed softly and typed a quick yes, then marked the date on my kitchen wall calendar with a red star. 3 months ago, I'd been a fixture in someone else's house. Now I was a name people passed along in rooms I'd never entered. Around 4, I finally opened the envelope David had slid under my apartment door the day before. It had sat untouched, tucked beneath the entry table, and I'd ignored it, on purpose because I wanted my mind clear before seeing his last attempt. Inside was a letter. Not typed. Handwritten. The script was familiar but slightly off-kilter, like it had been composed in a rush or without certainty. Mum, I got the counter-offer. It's not what I hoped for. But I can't say I didn't expect it. I talked to a lender. I might be able to secure the full amount. It won't be easy. It'll mean refinancing other things. I just want you to know, Sarah, and I didn't start out trying to take anything from you, that somewhere along the line, we stopped seeing you as a person. I see that now. Maybe too late. If you're still. Speak to me when this is all over. I'd be grateful. David. I read the letter twice. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just let it land. He hadn't apologized. Not directly. But he'd admitted to something. And sometimes that's the closest people can get when they're still tethered to pride. Folded the letter and slipped it into the back of my notebook. It didn't change the terms. It didn't undo the forged forms or the erasure. But it acknowledged the one thing I needed him to finally see, that I had never stopped being a person, even when he treated me like an extension of his comfort. That night, I stood at the window of my apartment and looked out at the city lights flickering on in uneven clusters. Behind me, the kitchen glowed with warmth, trays of glazed tarts catching the light like polished stones. I felt a stillness settle into my bones. Not exhaustion. Something more honest. Readiness. This chapter was ending. And I was the one holding the pen. The call came on a Tuesday. 2 days before the deadline, James had given David. It was late morning, and I was standing at the stovetop, stirring a lemon curd slowly over low heat, the kind of meditative motion that let my hands move while my mind stayed still. I saw James's name flash on the phone screen and turned the burner off before answering. He wired the full amount, James said without preamble. It cleared this morning. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The wooden chair creaked, familiar now. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound for a moment. All of it? I asked. Every penny. Plus interest. The wire confirmation is in your inbox. I'll forward you a final draft to sign by noon. I felt neither triumph nor relief. Just finality. A closing door that didn't slam but clicked softly shut. Thank you, James, I said. You did this, Margaret, he replied, with restraint and clarity. That's rare. After we hung up, I remained at the table, hands resting flat against the cooling grain of the wood. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to open the email. I simply breathed till it was done. The house I helped fund, the space I cleaned and cooked in, the rooms I'd once been allowed to share in the name of family. They were no longer mine in any legal way. But they hadn't felt like home in years. Not really. Ownership was never the heart of it. What I wanted, truly, was recognition. And in the end, David had paid what he owed not just in dollars, but in effort. And that mattered. I opened the email. The wire amount sat plainly on the line. Impersonal, but exact. A ledger corrected. A final receipt. I signed the closing documents and sent them back with the same steadiness I had stirred the lemon curd. No grand gestures. Just the next right thing. By mid-afternoon, the money had posted to my account. James texted a simple confirmation. Cleared. It's yours. That evening, I pulled out the ledger I'd kept since I left their house. I flipped past the pages of transactions and notes, past the margins where I'd written reminders not to shrink myself, and arrived at the back cover. I wrote 2 words, closed account, and then, without tearing anything out or drawing any lines through the entries, I folded the notebook and returned it to the top shelf of the closet, between my coat and the worn tote bag I used for deliveries. Not hidden, not displayed, just placed where it could rest. The next morning I returned to the courthouse downtown. Not for court proceedings, but for filing. I had registered Margaret Walsh Home Kitchen as a sole proprietorship a week earlier. Today I filed for expansion license, upgrades, food safety compliance, everything I needed to move into small-scale catering full-time. It took less time than I expected. A young clerk stamped the papers and handed them back to me with a smile. "Looks like you've got big plans," she said. "Bigger than I used to allow myself," I replied. Outside, the wind was gentler than the forecast promised. I walked slowly through the square, stopping at a cart to buy a single peach from a vendor who sold them firm and unwashed, just like Richard liked them. I bit into it without ceremony, juice running down my wrist, the sourness reminding me that not everything sweet has to be soft. When I returned home, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. Sarah's voice, halting, stiff with effort. "Hi, Margaret. It's Sarah. I heard about the wire transfer. I know things didn't end well. And I'm not calling to change that. I just wanted to say we told the kids the truth. About everything. About what you gave. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you'd want to know." She hung up before I could process what to feel. I sat for a long time with that quiet playing in the background, the click of the machine echoing slightly. Through the kitchen, they told the kids. I hadn't expected that, hadn't even hoped. But it landed heavier than I imagined, like someone had brushed dust off the corner of a photo and remembered who took it. I went to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water I'd been saving, poured it into a wine glass and sat on the balcony to drink it. No toast, just presence. The rosemary in the planter beside me had started to flower small, purple blossoms that didn't ask permission. Later that evening, I went through one final box I hadn't touched since moving. Inside were remnants. An old apron embroidered with David's toddler handprints, a photo of me at 35 holding him on my hip, and a small recipe card from my mother with smeared butter stains. I placed the handprint apron in a drawer, not to forget, but to give it a quieter place. Then I tucked the photo in the back of my recipe journal. It didn't need a frame. It didn't need forgiveness. It just needed a page. And finally, I taped the recipe card inside a cabinet door above the stove. Her handwriting faced me every time I reached for cinnamon. Still here. Still guiding. That night, I dreamed of a kitchen with no walls. Just light, warmth, and the smell of bread rising. The gala was only days away, and my kitchen had taken on the rhythm of a small orchestra. The hum of the oven door, the steady percussion of knives on the cutting board, the soft clatter of cooling racks shifting on the counter. I had long since stopped thinking of the space as temporary. It wasn't grand, but it worked hard. Like me, I'd ordered custom labels for the dessert boxes. Margaret Walsh Home Kitchen printed in deep navy ink on textured ivory. Beneath that, a single line in script, handcrafted with memory. It felt like truth. Every tart, every cookie, every folded napkin had a story behind it. And I'd chosen not to forget any of them. The counter was covered in trays that morning honey almond. Tartlets, rosemary crackers, lemon-glazed shortbreads. I was preparing the last batch of pastry dough when the intercom buzzed. I dusted the flour from my hands and pressed the button. "Delivery," the voice said. I wasn't expecting anything. Still, I slipped into my shoes, buttoned my sweater, and made my way downstairs. The delivery driver stood holding a flat white box sealed with a navy ribbon. No label, no sender. He passed it to me with a nod. "Have a good day, ma'am." Back. Upstairs, I placed it gently on the table and untied the ribbon. Inside was a framed photograph. Not old, not faded. It had been taken recently, clearly a school portrait. Lucy and Max, my two grandchildren, smiling in front of a painted autumn backdrop. They wore matching burgundy sweaters, both holding small signs that read, "We love you, Grandma." I pressed a hand to my chest. There was no note, no explanation. But I understood. It didn't absolve everything. It didn't erase the ways their parents had tried to push me aside. But the photo had been chosen, printed, framed, wrapped, and delivered. That required intention. I didn't cry. Instead, I cleaned the small table by the window, cleared away my recipe journals, and made space for the frame. I placed it beside the rosemary plant, facing the light. Then I stepped back and looked at the room, small, warm, full of things no one had given me, but that I'd made mine. There was a knock around noon. A gentle one. Miss Tan stood at the door, her arms folded over a clipboard. "Miss Walsh," she said, "I came to ask you something." "Of course, come in." She stepped inside, eyes scanning the racks of pastries cooling on every surface. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've been busy." "I have a gala coming up," I said. "And a few new clients." She smiled. "That's actually why I'm here." She set the clipboard on the table and turned it toward me. It was a form, simple and official looking. "I've got a vacant unit next door," she said. "It connects to yours through the storage wall. If you want it, I'll let you convert it into a commercial kitchen space. The zoning's already cleared. You just have to handle the cost of interior work." I blinked. "You're offering me a second kitchen." "I'm offering you space," she said, "because it's clear you're building something. And you're bringing good press to this place. People talk. You've got a gift." I looked down at the form. Rent increase, but nothing I couldn't manage now. The idea of having 2 ovens, a double prep station, maybe even a counter for walk-up orders, it felt possible. And that feeling alone felt radical. "I'll take it," I said. Before I could talk myself out of it. Ms. Tan grinned and scribbled her signature. "I'll drop off the keys Monday." After she left, I leaned against the counter, palms flat, breath shallow. There was a kind of wonder that didn't come with fireworks. It came with clean floors and unlocked doors and people who noticed your work. That afternoon, I found myself walking not with a destination in mind, but with that restless energy that comes from a dream beginning to unfold. I wandered into the bookstore on Franklin, the one I hadn't visited in years. It still smelled like binding glue and old carpet. I browsed the cookbooks half-heartedly, then drifted toward the journals. Between a stack of lined notebooks and gratitude planners was a leather-bound ledger. Navy blue, silver trim. I picked it up and ran my fingers along the cover dot. It felt like a beginning. I brought it home, unwrapped it slowly, and wrote one line on the first page. Kitchen 2. Orders. Inventory. Growth dot, not survival. Not defense dot, just forward motion. That evening, I cooked myself a real dinner, nothing sweet, nothing sampled from a tray. Just roasted vegetables, a slice of baked cod, and a soft roll still steaming. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and carried my plate to the small table where the photo sat. Lucy's smile reminded me of David when he was a boy. Before the world taught him how to be hard. Before I taught him to believe I'd always be there, no matter how much of me he took. Maybe one day he'd find his way back to that softness. But I no longer saw it as my work. After dinner, I washed the plate, dried the glass, and placed the towel neatly on the rack. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway, just looking at the clean counters, the labeled trays, the soft hum of a life fully owned. Then I picked up the framed photo, carried it to my bedroom, and placed it on the windowsill beside Richard's watch and my mother's rosary beads dot. It didn't fix everything, but it meant something had shifted. Remembered who I was, and I had never forgotten. I opened the door to Unit 2C with a quiet kind of reverence, the way someone might open an old diary or a box of saved letters. The key Ms. Tan had handed me still felt warm from her hand, and when I turned it in the lock, something inside me shifted to something that had waited patiently for decades to belong to a space not out of convenience, but of choice. The apartment smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. The walls were blank, the floors a pale laminate, and the windows dusty but wide. The kitchen was outdated, small stove, aging cabinets, but it had bones. Good bones. I walked through slowly, palms brushing the counters, cataloguing possibilities. Ovens against the back wall. Prep counter where the breakfast bar now stood. Custom shelving to hold trays and tools. A storage nook if I removed the coat closet. This wasn't just space, it was capacity. It was expansion. I stood in the middle of the empty living room and imagined rows of pastry boxes, a chalkboard menu leaning against the wall, herbs drying along the window ledge. I could see it now, not in vague hope, but in detail. For the first time in years, I felt momentum, not borrowed from someone else's schedule or made in the quiet hours between someone else's needs. Mine. Pulled a pen from my coat pocket and scribbled directly on the moving permit form Ms. Tan had left taped to the door. Install sink first. Paint, warm cream. Add shelving brackets before next week's mixer order. That afternoon, I moved in a few essentials: stacked baking trays, my large standing mixer, the small oak table Richard once carved initials into with the back of a butter knife. It wasn't much, but it made the space speak in my language. Later, I returned to my own unit and cooked dinner: soft lentils with roasted carrots and a touch of cumin, the kind of meal that filled a room quietly. I ate at the window, the new keys resting on the table beside my water glass. Across the alley, I could see the reflection of myself in the glass of the opposite building. Small, yes, but standing tall. That evening, I pulled down an old box from the top of my closet. Inside were blueprints I'd drawn by hand back when Richard and I talked half seriously about opening a pie shop. He'd encouraged the dream. Even started building a stand for farmers markets before his heart gave out too soon. I unrolled them on the table now. Some of the ideas were outdated. The handwritten prices for ingredients were laughably low, but the core was still there: efficiency. warmth, care. I traced the corners with my fingers and thought, what if it's not too late? The next morning, I walked through the neighborhood with my notebook tucked under my arm, stopping at two small businesses along the way, one, a cafe with chipped saucers, and a young barista who greeted me by name, the other a gift shop with a rotating table of local goods. I'd like to supply baked goods on consignment, I told them both. Twice a week. Clean labels, low sugar, locally made. The cafe owner, a man named Javier, tasted the sample muffin I'd brought and nodded slowly. You make this? I've been making food for people my whole life, I said. Now, I'm making it for myself. He smiled. Leave 10. We'll try them this weekend. The gift shop owner, Dahlia, said yes before even tasting. People buy what has a story. And you've got one. By the time I returned home, my notebook had more check marks than open boxes. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the new unit, scrubbing floors, removing old tape from the baseboards. By evening, I'd laid down the first pieces of equipment, a rolling rack, a spice shelf, and the electric kettle my sister had sent me years ago. It hadn't worked in her kitchen. It fit perfectly here. As I wiped down the last windowsill, I heard footsteps in the hallway. A soft knock. I opened the door to find Lucy, my granddaughter. She looked older than I remembered, taller. Her hair, longer, a shy tilt to her chin that reminded me painfully of her father at her age. Hi, Grandma, she said, holding out a paper bag. Mum said you might want these. I reached for it gently. Inside were the cookie cutters I thought had disappeared, shapes we used to make every December. Trees, stars, a clumsy reindeer whose antlers never quite came out right. You remembered? I said. She nodded. Dad said you used to make the best gingerbread. I couldn't quite speak. I opened the door wider. Want to see what I'm building? I asked. She stepped inside, eyes wide. It smells like cinnamon in here, she said. I smiled. That's the first thing I unpacked. She walked around the empty space, trailing her fingers over the countertop. You're going to sell cookies and stuff? More than that. But yes. She turned to me, serious now. Can I help? I blinked. Then nodded. We'll need aprons. And just like that, something opened. Asterisk. The following morning, Lucy returned before I'd even finished my tea. She stood in the doorway of Unit 2C, with a ponytail half-tied and a canvas tote slung over one shoulder. Inside were two aprons, one hers, splattered with old frosting stains, and another I recognized instantly. The blue one. The one she used to wear as a child, stitched with crypt letters that once spelled out Little Whisk. You kept it? I asked. She nodded, slipping inside like she belonged there. You taught me to bake in this. That was true. I had. I let her settle while I cleared a section of counter for us to work on. The space was still bare, but that morning it felt full, of warmth, of promise, of something I hadn't felt in years. Continuation. Lucy washed her hands without being asked, tied her apron loosely, and took her place beside me. We began with something simple, gingerbread. Not the dry kind people kept in tins and forgot. Ours was soft, rich with molasses and spice. The kind that made a room smell like memory. Should we make the reindeer? She asked, holding up the old cutter. The antlers never come out right. They never did. She laughed. We pressed the shapes into the dough, peeling the excess back slowly, laying each cookie on the tray like a small act of ceremony. While they baked, we rolled dough for another batch and talked. Not about the things we'd missed. Not about her father. Just about what was in front of us. She told me about school, how she liked science now, how she hated gym class. I listened, asked questions when it made sense, didn't push when she paused. I didn't know baking was so much measuring, she said after a while. It's measuring, I said, but also instinct. You'll know when something's right, even if it doesn't look like the picture. She looked up at me for a moment, searching my face, then went back to brushing egg wash across the tops of the next tray. When the first batch cooled, we tasted them warm. They were soft at the center, edges crisp with sugar. She grinned. They taste like Christmas. They taste like you helped, I said. We packed a dozen into a small white box and tied it with string. Can I bring these home? She asked. I hesitated. But then I nodded. Of course. They're not for Dad, she said quickly. They're for Max. He doesn't remember what yours tasted like. I turned away just slightly, pretending to adjust the cooling rack. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of our shared work. Her measuring, me guiding. Her decorating, me labeling. 2 generations filling a kitchen that only a month ago hadn't even existed in my plans. When she left, she hugged me tight, the way she used to when she was little arms around my waist, face pressed against my sweater. I kissed the top of her head and let her go. After she walked down the hall and disappeared around the stairwell, I stood for a moment at the door, breathing in the quiet. Then I returned to the work table. There was still more to do. That evening, I polished the oak table until its wood gleamed. I lined up my new product cards, rechecked the menu for the winter gala, and wrote out the final delivery list for the cafe. Then I sat at the far counter and began drafting a welcome message for the soft opening. I'd planned for the new space. Just a handwritten card on the door. Welcome to Margaret Walsh Home Kitchen. Baked with memory. Served with intention. We begin small but true. I looked around the space. It had taken effort, yes, but also faith. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't ask the world's permission. And just as I set the pen down, there was a knock. This time. It wasn't Lucy. It was David. He stood in the hallway holding something wrapped in brown paper. His shoulders were squared, but his eyes held a fatigue I recognized. Not from work or sleep, from reckoning. I heard about the new space, he said. From Lucy. I nodded but didn't step aside. I just wanted to see it, he said. If that's okay. I didn't answer. I opened the door. He stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the oven, the racks, the mixers. On the small table against the wall with the handwritten menus. It's beautiful, he said. It works, I replied. He handed me the wrapped package. It's nothing special. Just something I found in the attic last week when we were cleaning. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph. Me, in the kitchen of our old house. Flour on my nose, Lucy in my arms. Both of us laughing. Behind us, the counter cluttered with dough, mismatched bowls, and the first batch of cookies that never made it to the tray. I didn't know Sarah had taken this, I whispered. Didn't mean to erase you, he said. But I did. I looked up at him and I'm sorry. Not just for what I did with the money. For all of it. For making you feel like you didn't matter. I breathed. It didn't fix everything. But it was the one thing I needed to hear. I set the frame beside the rosemary plant, beside Lucy's gift, beside the future. Thank you for the picture, I said. That's all I needed tonight. He nodded and didn't ask for more. When he left, the room didn't feel heavy. It felt still. Whole.